I want to first say that today in my talk I'm really going to be presenting the work of other scientists, several scientists who've played really important roles in our understanding of human evolution and ultimately race. Much of this work began with scientists like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, and it continues today with scientists like Nina Jablonski, who studies skin. We'll talk about that. Sarah Tishkoff, who studies the evolution of human traits. And a good deal of the data and things I'm going to talk about come from a great book that was just put out by two scientists, Ian Tattersall and Rob DeSalle, to name a few. And I'll be putting those links up on the site as well, and I hope maybe later you'll read deeper, because we can only go so deep today. However, as most of you likely know, the historical record of the scientific enterprise around the construction of ideas regarding race is really dismal. Scientists have contributed to first the ideas regarding the existence of race, and then further ideas surrounding the innate biological inferiority or superiority of particular races. And as you probably know, these ideas have supported some of the most atrocious social policies of our past. Many scientists of the past several hundred years, products of their own societies, sought to identify biological components to race in a way that largely conformed to society's prejudices. They often failed to question the validity that race is a social construct, a product of our thinking. And really, even more sadly, many scientists over recent years have done little publicly to counter the notion that race and biology are linked, even though we've known for some time that this notion has been falsified. In fact, as I prepared for this talk, I read a recent study by sociologist Anne Moring, and she found that nearly 40% of all college and university biology faculty she interviewed agreed with the statement, "There are races of the species Homo sapiens." The result of this is a huge amount of misunderstanding about what race really is in biological terms. And so today we're going to discuss how many of the ideas that we as a society have about race are not rooted in objective science, because race is a scientific myth, even though it's a social reality. So I'm going to talk about human history and migrations, and I'm going to talk a lot about genetics, but really what I hope to do is that I want to illustrate to you how there is an amazing natural variation in our species, in humans, but it doesn't coincide with what you think of as racial lines. Okay, so the first thing I want to do to orient this talk is I want to make sure that you know that race is a product of our thinking and not our biology. And to orient you, I just want to remind you of some ways that we think, and they'll probably be familiar to you. We like to classify things. So to classify is an inherent part of human thinking. We like to put everything into groups. We also think hierarchically, right? So once we have things in groups, we see the world through systems of dominance and importance. And then finally, we're typological thinkers. And by that, when we think, especially when we think of species, we think of norms, right? When we think of races, we often think of norms rather than variation. In fact, in typological thinking, variation is kind of an error, right? Because you're really thinking of the average. This is exemplified, throughout human history. This diagram or this drawing from 1579 of the Great Chain of Being has, the rocks and the soils at the bottom and the plants, and as we go up, animals, and finally we hit man, and then the angels and the deities, right? So there's both classification and there's hierarchy and there's typology here. Now in biology, our first sort of big classifier was Carl Linnaeus. You may know that. If you remember from school, you learned the kingdoms and the phylums and all that stuff, right? So Carl Linnaeus is responsible for that. This is the cover of his book. And now he was important for many reasons. So he was the first person, first of all, he was kind of he really went out there because he was the first person to classify humans alongside with animals. And at that time, that was really sort of a crazy notion. In fact, he went so far to put humans alongside the chimpanzees, and that was really out there. But at the same time, he classified on the genus and species level, he put Homo sapiens into subgroups, right? He had the group Feris, or wild. He had Monstrosus, Americanus. I don't know how close those two were to each other, but anyway. Now, it was finally with Darwin, though, that we could start to, at least in biology, we started to get away from typological thinking, right? Because Darwin introduced us to this idea of population thinking. And in Darwin's view, there really isn't a norm or a type, right, of anything. For him, the average is really quite meaningless. For Darwin, it was the variation in a population, and that's the engine of evolution. And so really, the key for us to understand human diversity, we have to understand the evolutionary process that produced our species. Okay. Now, Darwin, though, I want to point out, was also a product of his time. And he didn't talk much about this in The Origin of Species, but later on when he published The Descent of Man, he did wonder. He said he didn't know if man was one species or two or 46, I think it went up to. And there's another problem with The Origin of Species that carries over today. Not with the content, but the title. So the title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And if you can't read the little words underneath, it says or, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. And so at this time, the term species, or maybe even subspecies, and race, they get equated. Now, I want to stop for a second and tell you what a race is in biology. So there is some definitions for race. I'll come back to it, but I want to just give you a good notion of it. Races are interbreeding groups of animals. Okay, so they interbreed, but they're genetically distinct from other interbreeding groups of their own species, right? So they're usually geographically isolated, and that's what makes them distinct. Now, we'll come back to this notion, but I want you to understand that we do have definitions of that in biology. And in the 18th century, scientists began to apply the term race to human populations. Okay. So using a Darwinian framework, I want to frame our discussion today. We're going to look at macroevolutionary patterns in the apes. So this is a phylogeny. This is how we draw the connection of organisms in biology. And so this line at the bottom that goes along the bottom here means that these organisms share a common ancestor. Okay? And the numbers at the bottom of those lines represent time in millions of years. Okay, so that's time on the millions of years scale. And we know we can document this both from the fossil record and also from genetic data, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. Now, at some point around 30 million years ago, you can see that the old world monkeys and the apes diverged from each other. And then finally, around 6 million years ago, we diverged from our closest relative, the chimpanzees. Okay? Now, I want you to look at this map for a second at the bottom, because it also starts to put us we need to get our geography down. So if you see over in Asia, you see that we have the gibbons and orangutans, and it's in Africa that we have the gorillas and the chimpanzees and ultimately humans. Okay, and that geography is going to be really important. And another main point that I want to make to you today is that humans and chimps and gorillas, right, these are what we call the African great apes. So it's just entirely accurate. In fact, it's the most accurate thing I think I can say today. We are all African apes, right? All of us, that's what we are. Okay, now I have another phylogeny here. So it's, and I want to make some important points about it. This phylogeny is based on genetic data, like sequencing pieces of DNA from orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. And so the length of the little lines are important. So if you see the modern humans over here, these are like little twigs, right? And you see some of the other, the gorillas and orangutans and chimpanzee, and you see their lines are longer. The longer a line, that means more diversity, okay? And so here's another thing that would be accurate to say. If we looked at all modern humans, all the humans on the planet today, they have less diversity than just one branch of the chimpanzees. Okay, so It's really important as we go on for you to understand that. Now, using genetic evidence and fossil evidence, we can start to think about modern humans and where they came from. And the oldest site that we have for modern humans right now, right, so this is a lot of archaeology, is in southern Ethiopia, and the dating is around 150 to 190,000 years ago. Now we also know, if you look at this, around 100,000 years ago, if I were to draw a line up there around 100,000 years, that Homo sapiens, or modern Homo sapiens, was inhabiting the planet with other Homo-like species, okay? And in fact, we'll talk about this a little later, but there is some evidence that Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals certainly hung out in the same regions, and they actually may have even bred with each other. Okay, but I want to focus in even more. I want to go to Homo sapiens now. But before I do that, I have to give you like a little bit of a DNA lesson, okay? Because we're going to have to talk about DNA. I know, you probably are like, really? But you probably know some of this already, right? You all know that you have chromosomes in your cells, right? You got 22 pairs of what are called the autosomes. And if you're female, most likely you have 2 X chromosomes. And if you're male, you have an X and a Y, okay? Now, all those chromosomes except the Y, they undergo what's called extensive recombination. And what that means is that every single, like even within you, they're just sharing, they're mixing up, right? Your paternal, I'm really sorry, this thing's driving me nuts. Your maternal and your paternal chromosome are exchanging information all the time. So they're massively recombining. And so they're really good for us to study diversity. We'll come back to that. Okay. The Y chromosome doesn't do that. It's a lot like this other chromosome I'm talking about, which is the mitochondrial chromosome. You get that just from your mother, okay? It hangs out in an organelle inside your cell. It's a circular molecule. It's inherited from mother to offspring, and it stays pretty stable. I'm not saying it doesn't change. It gets mutations, but it doesn't recombine. So it's a really good marker, along with the Y chromosome, to trace evolutionary history, okay? So we're going to use both of those markers today. Okay. When we sequence the mitochondrial genome and parts of the Y chromosome from lots of peoples on the planet, we also now, and chimpanzees, and we also now have the ability to sequence DNA from the remains that we can find, okay? In fact, I don't know if you know this, we even sequenced the Neanderthal genome last year. When we do that, and we look at all of the genetic data that we have, we see that the oldest lineage that we have, as I said this before, the oldest lineages are in Africa, and that all other lineages have a subset of the genetic diversity that originated in Africa. And so all the data we have supports a hypothesis for an African origin of all modern humans around 200,000 years ago. Now, about 50,000 years ago to maybe 100,000 years ago, very small bands of modern humans started to disperse, right? They moved to other regions of Africa, and some of them even started to move out of Africa. Now, I'm talking really small bands, maybe just like hundreds or a few thousand individuals moving to these places. Now, I just want you to imagine this. If I have a lot of diversity here in a population and only a small number move out, then I haven't taken a lot of genetic diversity with me, right? A subset of the diversity has moved out when this happens. We call that in biology a founder effect, or we say that there's a population bottleneck, but really that's what it means. It's just a small amount of the diversity. Okay, now we know that the earliest migrations occurred from Southeast Asia, or out into Southeast Asia and Austromelanesia. Modern humans arrived in Europe around 40,000 years ago, and this may sound like a long time to you, but in biological terms, this is actually quite recent. Went to Asia around 30 to 60,000 years ago, and we didn't get over until the North Americas, sometime between 15 to 35,000 years ago. And remember, at this time, there was at least back in these time periods, there were other Homo-like organisms. Okay, but here's what I want you to imagine right now, because I'm only going to give you one way that we could have races in humans, okay? If this is what happened, these migrations happen, and these folks stayed right here, and these folks stayed right here, and these folks stayed right here, and they stayed here, and they stayed here, okay? And they stayed there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they didn't go anywhere else, okay? And a lot of time went by, and they lived in those places. There might have been environmental conditions that would lead to them being more reproductively isolated from other populations. And then, and only then, might we have races in Homo sapiens. However, that's not what happened. Okay, this map is still early migrations, folks. We're still thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago. The blue lines on this map represent us looking at Y chromosome data of human migrations, and the yellow lines represent migrations using mitochondrial DNA, so maternal and paternal lineages. And I don't know what you see up there, but what I see is coming out of Africa into other parts of Africa, I see like a noodles. That's what I see when I see it, right? But what do you really see? You see that there's just been extensive migrations. You see at least 3 Y chromosomal, or 3 mitochondrial and 2 Y chromosomal lineages just coming over into North America. And you see that sometimes, a group comes and then they loop back around. And so there's just extensive migrations of Homo sapiens on the planet. Now, I think we've established we're all Homo sapiens. So we're a single species. And when you have species, a single interbreeding unit, 2 kinds of things can happen, okay? And this is probably, in my mind, this is the most important part for you to listen to, okay? One thing that can happen is divergence, right? You can diversify, absolutely. You can have diversification, and that's when those local populations move to a region, and they live there for a while, and slight changes start to occur, and there's slight genetic differences that lead to maybe physical appearances or things that could distinguish them from their neighbors. Okay, but the next thing that can happen, and I'm talking to any species here, is reintegration. And that's when these slightly differentiated populations move back and come into contact with each other. And when that happens, the boundaries that started to form between different local populations, they become blurred, and over time they're just erased. The boundaries are erased. And reintegration has occurred throughout human history, this really, really long history that we have, and it's sped up today because of the great migration and widespread mating of individuals that we have from disparate regions, okay? So these are the main points I want to make. I'm going to give examples later, but our time scale is very short. We've only been around for 200,000 years, okay? And all the diversity that we see out of Africa accumulated only 50 to 60,000 years ago. So the racial differences that you perceive, right, they're really superficial in genetic terms. But this is why it's simultaneously possible for you to intuitively recognize what you might construe as races based largely on phenotypes. But it's hopeless to define them biologically or to try to draw clear lines, okay? And the big point is we've been doing work in this area over the last 10 years, and every study points to the same thing. Admixture and expansion, admixture and expansion. Homo sapiens really likes to mate, and wherever we go, wherever we meet, that's what we do, we mate and we mix, and so that's what we've been doing. Okay, so what of biological race then? Right? The biological definition of race is that you have a geographically isolated breeding population that shares certain characteristics and higher frequencies than other populations of that species, right? They're more in common. But it hasn't become reproductively isolated from other populations. That's the definition. But that genetic diversity that resulted from the extensive hybridization that's occurred in the last 200,000 years, from this, the vast majority of the diversity found within any historically defined race, well, it's shared among all the other historically defined races. And so the boundaries are just arbitrary. Biologically speaking, they're arbitrary, right? So race in humans doesn't have a biological meaning. I worked on the Human Genome Project before the human genome was sequenced, like back when we were trying to figure out how we would sequence the genome. And most of you might know it was around 2000 or 2001, we got the sequence of the first human genome. Since then, the technology for being able to sequence genomes has kind of gone through the roof. Okay, so we've sequenced genomes, as I said, we're even sequencing genomes of extinct individuals. And this is what I can say about this data. From the human genome data, we could say that the concept of race has no genetic basis. Genetics doesn't offer any support for those that wish to put racial boundaries around groups. There's just no scientific support. Now, certainly there are traits that are clustered in specific populations more than others. Absolutely, I'm going to talk about a few of those in a second. Skin color, hair form, so on. But race really is little more than skin deep in biological terms, because as I said before, individuals are frequently more genetically similar to members of other so-called races than they are to their own said race. I think this picture of Yao Ming and Christina Aguilera and Shaquille O'Neal, it really is emblematic of the cool diversity that can be part of our species. But the results show that when individuals are sampled from around the globe, the pattern seen isn't of discrete clustering, okay, but rather of gradients of genetic variation on the planet. So there's just no reason for us to assume that race has any relevance for our understanding human genetic history. Now, I want to give you some examples so that when you're thinking about this later, you have something really tangible, right? Because I keep saying the data, and you're not getting a chance to analyze the data. And I always tell my students, like, don't let me get away with that, right? Don't just let me tell you data. Like, so I'm going to give you some examples. So the first one I'm going to give you is about your ability to digest milk, okay? And it's a great example of what I mean here. So lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk, it evolved actually multiple times in the course of human evolution. It evolved in different populations of humans around the world, and it tracks exactly to cultural milk drinking activities, okay? So let me just explain what I mean. Milk has a compound called lactose, and you need lactase to be able to digest it. It breaks it down into glucose and galactose, and your body loves that stuff, and all your cells are happy and can use it. Now, infants, all on the planet, well, doesn't matter where you come from, most infants have the ability to metabolize lactose. So they have lactase, they can break down lactose, they're lactose tolerant. But at weaning, the majority of people on this planet, right now, the majority of the people on this planet are lactose intolerant, actually. The gene that makes lactase gets turned off. However, there is a mutation that leads to the gene just staying on. It just stays on in adulthood, okay? And that's where you get lactase persistence. This slide's a little busy, so I'm going to break it down for you. When scientists started examining the genes associated with lactase persistence, here's what they saw. Okay, so just this means that parts of the population have more or less amounts of lactase persistence, right? So you can have these pieces of the pie. I don't know how well that projects, but that's not a good color choice. But you got the dark purple and the light purple. The dark purple is lactase non-persistence. And so I'm just going to, let's look at Africa for a second, okay? Awesome biologist, Sarah Tishkoff, she did this work in Africa. It was very difficult to do. She had to go all over Africa and ask people to participate in this study. And here's what she found. She found that when she went, parts of Africa where people had agriculture that involved cattle, and they drank milk, at least over long periods of time, that was known to occur in that part of Africa, natural selection had happened, such that lactase persistence evolved in the population. She, in fact, showed that it was about over about a 7,000-year period. Whereas other parts of Africa, where the populations in the past were more hunter-gatherers, the allele for lactase persistence was infrequently present. It was there, but infrequently present. Now, here's the interesting part. The same thing happened in parts of Europe. If you look in Northern Europe, you see a lot of lactase persistence, but in Southern Europe, much less. And if we move over to India, we see a similar pattern, right? So independently evolving lactase persistence, and it totally, if you were just to be able to overlay the societies on top of here, the cultural practices, you would see that this is how lactase persistence evolved. Now here's the point. If you walked up to these three individuals, right, you would likely say they're in different races. Right, but these three folks have more in common with each other than they do with lots of other people in their country of origin, okay, around this particular allele. Okay. I want to talk about skin, right, because skin is what we use. That is our main visual cue that we use to put people into groups. So look at that picture at the top. And the first thing that I want you to see is I think Darwin would really like this picture, right? Because it shows variation, and I challenge you to tell me what the norm is. There's not a norm, there's not an average, there's just variation, okay? Now, I'm first going to explain these two maps, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about skin. So this is a map from the National Geographic Society, and it's a map of UV radiation, okay? UV is strongest at the equator, and as we move towards the poles, UV radiation decreases, okay? And you can kind of see it in the gradations of colors they've put on this map, okay? Now over here is a map of skin pigmentation, okay? And if you look at this map and you look at this map, I'll let you look at them, so I hope you can get a visual image, that you see that there's darker pigmentation in regions where we have the highest UV in general, okay? Now, let me just tell you a little story about skin. Skin is one of your most important organs. You may not think of it as an organ, but it is. And it covers all of your body. It's a crucial organ. And skin has a protectant, and its protectant is melanin, okay? So melanin is an important compound to protect skin. Skin has a really complex relationship with UV, okay? There's two kinds of UV radiation, the long and the short wavelength. You may or may not have heard that before. But the longer wavelength, called UVA, it destroys a really important compound called folate. So folate, well, I think about folate because I know it's needed for DNA synthesis, right? And I think you all know you need DNA, so that's important. If you've been a pregnant woman, you might have heard of folate from your doctor because they say make sure you get your vitamins with folate. Folate is really important for preventing birth defects. You have low folate, you have a high frequency of birth defects or miscarriages. So as you can see, folate is really important for your survival, okay? So high UV, you need some protection against destroying your folate. However, if you get the other issue you have is your skin needs the short wavelength UV, that's UVB, and UVB stimulates the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for calcium metabolism. Now you probably heard calcium is important for your bones, and it absolutely is, but it's important for lots of other parts of your body as well. It's important so your brain functions properly and many of your organ systems. Okay, so you've got this really interesting relationship with the sun that we've got going on here in our skin, and it is very likely that our ancestors, remember, they were in Africa. And it's the highest UV, it's one of the highest UV locations on the planet, that our ancestors had strong selection for dark skin pigmentation to prevent the breakdown of folate, okay? So to protect against folate depletion. And as the early modern humans moved out of Africa, they likely encountered strong selection against that high melanin, right? So that they would allow, because once you get out of those regions, in fact, I wish I had time, I could show you a real, in fact, I'll put this up later on the website. There's a great video showing how, because the Earth isn't flat, that's another cool thing. But since it's round, remember that the UV radiation hits it in different ways. And so in some parts of the world, you don't get very much UVB at all, right? And so there would be really strong selection against that melanin so that you could be able to get vitamin D. So like lactase persistence, skin pigmentation, changes in skin pigmentation, they didn't just evolve once, they evolved multiple times. So if you look around the room and you see someone that has a skin pigmentation like yours, you would be really incorrect to assume that they're more related to you than someone else in the room. Okay? I also, this is like my little public service announcement in the middle. We often hear about the issue that we have with UV, like if you have fair skin and you go to a place like Australia, they say be really careful because it's high UV, and in terms of the skin, light-skinned people are not very well adapted to go to high UV places. But we don't often hear the reverse, and I want to make sure that we talk about that. And that's when people with very dark skin go to places that don't have much UV, right? Or you work indoors all the time. You really have to be careful about vitamin D deficiency. And so we have to think about our skin in those terms. Now, we're recently starting to find some of the genes. It looks like there's about 5 to 10 genes that are involved in producing the exact pigmentation that we have. And we are finding evidence that natural selection acted on those genes. And so I just want to make sure that we think about this. What we describe in the United States right now, we use these terms, blacks and whites. Not only are these not biologically coherent groups, I'm really bothered by these terms because they're just not accurate, right? No one is actually white and no one is actually black, right? We're all varying shades of brown. Okay, now I have one more example just because I really want you to walk away from here saying, okay, traits evolve in populations due to selective forces, right? It has much less to do with your assigned race. And so here we have, the last example I'll give you in this area is a particular disease. You may have heard before, like sickle cell anemia is an African American disease. You may have heard cystic fibrosis is a Caucasian disease, or Tay-Sachs is a Jewish disease, right? I can't give you all of these, but I'm just going to do sickle cell, okay? So if you look here, here's the world again, and where you have red, you have high malaria, right? So malaria is common and it's transmitted throughout the region. Yellow is less, and green is where malaria transmission doesn't really occur, okay? So now just blow up Africa and come over here. And I want to tell you about the sickle cell allele. So in most cases, you have a form of hemoglobin that makes really nice plump red blood cells, okay? If you have sickle cell anemia, you have 2 copies of a gene, and you would make lots of cells of this shape, and this causes you a lot of health problems, okay? Now, individuals that have 1 copy of hemoglobin and 1 normal copy and 1 copy that has this mutation, they do make some sickle cells. I'm not saying there's no problems with that disease. There are some health effects, but they're very mild compared to actually having sickle cell anemia. However, these individuals have extra resistance to malaria, right? And so if you look at this map and you look over here, this is the percent of the population that has the sickle cell allele. And so what you see is the allele is strong. It's actually not over all of Africa, right? Just parts of Africa have this sickle cell allele in the population. We also have parts of India. And so again, you have to be careful when you think about, often when you go to the doctor, right, and we're going to talk about this is the last thing I'm going to talk about is medicine. Often when you go to the doctor, you're asked your race, right? And your race sometimes dictates what's going to happen. And so we need to be really careful because there are plenty of Caucasians, because remember, we've been mixing and mixing and mixing for a very long time. And so there are plenty of people that even come from regions that aren't affected by the malaria parasite that also have sickle cell. Okay. But the main thing that I want to say is that the gene variant for sickle cell disease is related to malaria, not race, not even skin color. Okay. I want to fast forward into like right now, because I think that there are a couple of areas that biology is continuing to affect by, frankly, bad thinking. And the area of race-based medicine has become prevalent. And here's why it has become prevalent. I actually think that the reason wasn't a bad one, and it's this. So Congress mandated several years ago that when the National Institutes of Health gives money for science, when they give money to clinical scientists, they have mandated that the scientists choose their samples on racial and ethnic lines. Right? So the scientists have to ask the people participating in their study, what is your race, what is your ethnicity, and they have to bin their data. I mean, that should right now, if you've been listening today, you should go, why? Why are they doing that? There was a good reason for doing that, right? Because we really want to work on eliminating or reducing health disparities. Unfortunately, this acts to reinforce the notion that there are biological differences among human populations. I mean, that's really what that does. And, or that if there are any biological differences, that they're somehow significant. Individuals fall ill, not populations, unless we're talking about an epidemic of, you know, I say that for my colleague, Dr. R.J. Shishak. Yes, they do. Yes, they. But I'm talking about genetically predisposed illness. Belonging to a socioculturally defined race is a very poor predictor of your genes. That's really important for you to know for your own personal health. Although race is void of biological function, though, it does have profound social reality. And this is where it's really important for us to understand that race itself isn't a causal factor in disease. It isn't. But the problem with racialized medicine, okay, the problem is that it overlooks the evidence that discrimination, that poverty, that stress, that restricted access to education and health care, all of these things underlie disparities between the different racial and ethnic groups. So, for example, what I mean by this, high blood pressure is as much a social disease as it is a biological one. In the United States, we're allocating right now $2.7 billion a year for what's called health disparity research, and I totally support that. But the problem is the assumption that's been made that ethnic and minority populations are genetically predisposed to particular complex diseases. That is just an invalid biological assumption, but we're just letting it, even scientists, we're just letting it keep going on. And the focus here on the genes, and I'm a geneticist and I'm saying the focus on the genes is the problem here instead of looking to the social causes of these diseases. So, you know, in my mind, racialized medicine needs to be replaced with something. Personalized medicine, maybe, but that's going to remain very costly for a long time, and we all have access to it. Maybe looking instead at our ancestral groups, right? Because we do know that we can know something about our genetics from ancestry, but it's certainly not looking at our racial groups in this way. And a problem that can result from this is the following. And so, you know, I've been talking to some of my colleagues. I was talking to someone the other day in the medical profession. I said, but, you know, this isn't really doing any harm, is it? Right? So at least we're shining a light on on disparities, health disparities among different ethnic and racial groups. But I'm going to give you an example of where this could take us. Okay? So this is data in the United States. This is from 2006. This is the death rate due to heart disease by race and ethnicity. And if you just look really quickly here, you see that the highest death rate for heart disease is in African American men and African American women. Okay. Now, a lot of people then, their brain goes straight to, well, there's genetic differences, right, between African American men and African American women and this other group, and did people go down, and I mean scientists start to go down this pathway, and that's where the wrong thinking comes in. And here's an example of what happened. So I think this is really a form of racial profiling in my mind. It's becoming evident in this industry. So this drug Bidil over here was, it was approved by the FDA as an anti-heart attack agent, specifically to be marketed to African Americans, on the grounds that they have this biological propensity for heart disease brought on by high blood pressure, okay? But not only is this drug not effective for all African Americans, it's perfectly effective for some Caucasians, which should make total sense to you after what we've been talking about today. Now, despite the solid lack of evidence that it worked better for African Americans than anyone else, it was approved to use in black heart patients, okay? Now, there are indeed significant health risks for blacks and whites in the US that require social action, but Bidil wasn't a health measure because here's the deal. Bidil was two generic drugs that they just stuck into one pill. And they said, by sticking them in one pill, we've reduced your pill burden, and then we can charge you a higher amount of money for this drug because it's now a special drug. Okay? That's where wrong thinking can take us, and it takes us there now. Race is a hierarchical social construct, and it assigns human value and group power. And social constructs are human inventions, and they're products of our mind. I'm not saying that they're imaginary, but these racialized taxonomies have real consequences on biological functions, including the expression of genes. I'm teaching a course right now. I see some of my students in epigenetics, right? In the course, we talk about the ways in which the environment that we live in can change our genes, right? So it's not that we have differences because we're in different races. It's because we experience life in a different way because we're different races. And those stressors, those can affect the genes that get turned on and off and lead to disease. And that's very real. Okay, the last thing I want to leave you with, so is ancestry the answer though, right? And this will be the last thing I talk about, there's a lot of groups that are selling this to you, right? There's about 10 to 12 companies right now. You can swish around some spit and send them your DNA, and they will tell you something. Some of them are telling you that they'll tell you your race, and I would be aware of them. Others are much better. I did this. Okay, I wanted to know something. Well, I also wanted to know all my disease alleles because I'm a geneticist and I don't know why I wanted to. Now, ancestry, as I've been telling you all day, it does have clear meaning to individuals, and there are things that you can know, but you got to be really careful, again, how you interpret the data, because this may take us down another wrong path. So I'm going to tell you here's my own little story. So my mom died when I was very young, and I don't know much about her family. Right, so I started thinking to myself, I can have my mitochondrial DNA sequenced, and I can know something. I can know something about myself, right? So I sent it in, and I had it sequenced, and I come up, and I'm maternal haplogroup U5A1B. Okay, so you might say, now what does that mean? Haplogroup U5, well, first of all, haplogroup U, it descends from a woman who lived about 55,000 years ago somewhere in Western Asia. Please keep track of the places I tell you. Western Asia. The U's, U1 through 8, they were widely distributed, and their descendants came from Western Eurasia, North Africa, South Asia. Now, U5 in particular was estimated to come about around 30 to 50,000 years ago. And the remains of individuals that have U5, they're distributed all over England, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, Russia, Sweden, France, Spain. The U5As are, okay, so let me look at this map. This is like the confidence level of where this maternal mitochondria maps to around 500 years ago. And you see, like, these folks are way up where it's cold. And that sort of freaked me out, right? Because I like hot weather, and I couldn't imagine that I had people from there. These populations are the Basques, the Samis or the Laplanders of northern Scandinavia. So great. So now I could say like, oh great, I'm Scandinavian, right? But here's the problem with this, okay? Just like all of you, I have a mom and a dad, right? And so this does it, dad's out in this study. And just like all of you, I have 4 grandparents, right? And my dad's, his people are out, and so is my mom's dad, right? You following me? Got 8 grandparents in the next generation. I'm just talking about one of them. 500 years ago, that's about 20 generations. 2 to the 20th, it's 1 million. I know 1 in 1 million of my ancestors. I'm glad to know, all really glad to know about her. But what you see here is I know 1 in 1 million of my ancestors at this point. I've got nearly 1 million other ancestors that were migrating all over this planet. You might ask who this guy is. So this is an aside. It's a little aside, but I have to tell you a story about my daughter. So the Samis very likely overlap the Neanderthals. In fact, this company just sent me my estimated percent of my genome that's Neanderthal, and it's 2.8%. Awesome. And so this is showing that the Sami, these folks that, you know, my great so on grandma overlapped with the Neanderthals. My daughter saw me looking at this. She's 5, and she said, "Who is that?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe like great-great-great-great-great-grandfather." And so now she'll ask me, like, "Can we look at Grandpa's picture?" Why not? But really, the point, the last thing that I want to leave you with is where I started with, which is that we've been mixing for a long time. And so the best that I can tell you is that we're Homo sapiens. We're all really African apes. So, thank you.